The fluorescent light in the break room had been flickering for 3 weeks. Nobody fixed it. That was the kind of place Halverson and Reed was. Things broke, and you either fixed them yourself or learned to live with the flicker. I've been living with a lot of flickers for 12 years. My name doesn't matter as much as the story. But I'll tell you this. I was 51 years old. I had a mortgage in Naperville, a son finishing his junior year at University of Illinois, and a wife who'd been patient with me through 2 recessions, 1 layoff before this job, and approximately 400 Sunday evenings where I sat at the kitchen table going over spreadsheets instead of watching TV with her. I was the regional operations director for the Midwest division. I had built that division, not exaggerating. When I came in 12 years ago, we had 11 accounts and a team of 4. When I walked out, we had 63 accounts and a team of 22. I'm not telling you this to brag. I'm telling you this so you understand what it felt like when they handed it to someone else. Her name was Becca. She was my boss's niece, my boss being Terrence Whitfield, VP of Operations, a man who wore fleece vests in July and said things like, "Let's move the needle," without any irony whatsoever. Becca had been with the company for 4 months. Before that, she'd done some marketing work for a cosmetic startup in Phoenix that, from what I could find, no longer existed. She was 28. She was enthusiastic. She sent emails with 3 exclamation points in the subject line. And on a Thursday afternoon in March, Terrence called me into his office and told me she would be taking over the regional director role, effective in 30 days, and that I was being repositioned into a senior advisor capacity. Senior advisor. I sat across from him and I kept my face completely still. I've been told I have a good poker face. My wife says it's not a virtue, that I hold things in too long. She's probably right. But right then, in that office, with Terrence explaining in his careful, rehearsed voice that the company was evolving its leadership model and that my institutional knowledge would be invaluable in an advisory role, I just nodded. I asked one question. I said, "What does the advisory compensation look like?" He slid a paper across the desk. I looked at it. It was a 14% pay cut. I said, "I'll need some time to review this." He said, "Of course, take the weekend." I drove home in silence. My hands were steady on the wheel. The radio was off. I didn't call my wife until I was parked in the driveway, and even then, I sat there for a moment, watching the garage door, thinking about 12 years. Thinking about the Hendricks account I'd saved in 2019, when the previous director had burned the relationship, and Terrence had called me on a Saturday and said, "Fix it or we lose them," and I'd driven 3 hours to a client dinner and spent 5 hours convincing them to stay. Thinking about the Christmas Eve I worked until 9 p.m. because a distribution contract had a clause that needed redrafting. Thinking about the 2 raises I was promised and one I actually received. Thinking about the performance review 3 years ago where Terrence had written in writing on an official document, "Irreplaceable contributor to division growth." Irreplaceable. Right. My son texted me while I was sitting there. He said, "Dad, you coming in? Mom made that chicken thing." I went inside. My wife knew before I said anything. She has that ability. She reads the way I carry my shoulders. She poured me a glass of water and didn't say anything while I sat at the kitchen table and explained what had happened. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want to do?" I said I didn't know yet. She said, "Yes, you do." She was right. I knew. I'd known sitting in that parking lot. I'd known, honestly, the moment Terrence slid that paper across the desk. But knowing what you want to do and being able to do it are 2 different things when you have a mortgage and a kid in college and 51 years on the clock. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark and ran numbers. Our savings. My wife's income. She's a physical therapist. Good practice. Steady. What I could draw from the 401k without penalties at my age. My son's tuition timeline. 1 more year. Then he'd be done. Health insurance. COBRA. The market for someone with my background. Around 2 in the morning, I got up and went to the kitchen and made coffee. I wasn't going to drink and sat there doing what I'd been doing for 12 years, solving a problem. Except this time, the problem was my own life. By 4 a.m., I had a rough picture. It wasn't comfortable, but it was possible. I went back to bed. My wife reached over without waking up and put her hand on my arm. I don't know how she knew I was there. I did not tell Terrence anything on Friday. I acted normal, answered emails, sat in a project review meeting, nodded in the right places. Becca was in that meeting? She sat at the far end of the table and took notes in a pink notebook and twice referred to our distribution flow as the pipeline thing. And I watched two of my team members exchange a look so fast most people would have missed it. I didn't miss it. After the meeting, my colleague Dwight, who'd been with me for 7 of the 12 years and knew more about our Midwest accounts than anyone except me, stopped me in the hallway. He said very quietly, "I heard." I said, "Don't do anything." "Not yet." He looked at me for a second. He nodded. That weekend, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a man named Kellerman, Randall Kellerman, who ran a mid-sized logistics consulting firm out of Indianapolis. I'd met him at a conference in 2021 and we'd stayed in loose touch. He'd asked me twice, casually, whether I'd ever thought about making a move. I'd said no both times. On Saturday morning, I called him and I said, "You still interested in that conversation?" There was a pause. Then he said, "I've been waiting for you to call for 2 years." The second call was to my attorney. Not for anything dramatic, just to understand where I stood on non-competes. My contract had a 12-month non-compete clause, which I knew, but the language was specific. It restricted me from working with direct competitors in the same vertical. Kellerman's firm wasn't a direct competitor, it was adjacent. My attorney listened, asked 3 questions, and called me back Sunday afternoon with good news. Monday morning, I went into the office. I typed a resignation letter that was 4 sentences long. I printed it. I walked into Terrence's office at 9:15 a.m., closed the door behind me, and put it on his desk. He looked at it. He looked at it. He said, "You're serious?" I said, 2 weeks notice as agreed in my contract. I'll make sure the transitions are properly documented." He said, "I think we should talk about this. The advisory role. There's room to negotiate." I said, "I appreciate that, but I've made my decision." He started to say something about the timing being difficult, about Becca needing my support through the transition, about how much the company valued me. I stood there and listened to all of it. Then I said, "I'll make sure the documentation is thorough. She'll have everything she needs." And I left. I sat at my desk for a minute after. My hands were on the keyboard. The fluorescent light down the hall was still flickering. I started documenting. I want to be honest about something. The next 2 weeks were not easy. There is a specific loneliness in working out your notice when everyone knows you're leaving. People treat you differently. Some warmer, some more distant, some suddenly very interested in things they'd never cared about before. Becca started shadowing me in client meetings, and I watched her try to establish rapport with people who had my cell phone number saved under "guy who actually fixes things." I was professional with her. I showed her everything I was supposed to show her. I documented the accounts, the relationships, the histories, the quirks of each major client. I was thorough because I am thorough. That's not for her, that's just who I am. On my second to last day, my team took me out to lunch. 12 people at a long table at the Italian place on Madison. Nobody brought it up directly. Nobody said this is wrong or we're angry, but there was something in the room that didn't need to be said. Dwight gave a short toast. He said, "To the guy who taught us that if you do the work right, you don't have to do it twice." I didn't trust my voice for a second. I lifted my glass. My last day was a Wednesday. I cleaned out my desk, not much, I'd never been one for personalization, dropped off my badge and shook Terrence's hand in the hallway. He said something about staying in touch. I said sure. I walked out into a gray April afternoon and got in my car and drove home. My wife had taken the afternoon off. She'd made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table together and she asked me how I felt, and I told her the truth. I felt scared and I felt free and I wasn't sure which one was louder. She said, "That sounds about right." I started at Kellerman's firm 6 weeks later after my attorney confirmed the timeline worked and after I'd spent those 6 weeks doing something I hadn't done in 12 years, sleeping past 6 a.m., going on walks, eating dinner at an actual table before 8 p.m. My son called me one Sunday and said, "Dad, you seem different." I asked him, "Different how?" He thought about it. He said, "Like you're not carrying something." The new role was Regional Development Director. Salary was slightly higher than what Halverson and Reed had been paying before the demotion offer. The team was smaller. I was rebuilding something again, which I'd come to understand was just what I did. About 3 months in, I got a call from someone I recognized, one of my largest former accounts. a distribution manager named Kowalski, who'd been with that company for 20 years and called me every time there was a real problem. He said, "I heard you're at Kellerman's now." I said yes. He said, "We've been having some issues with the transition. Is there a conversation we could have?" I said there could be. I want to be careful here because I'm not interested in making this about revenge. It wasn't. Kowalski's company needed what we offered, and we were the right fit. That's business. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a moment sitting across from Kowalski in a conference room in Schaumburg, shaking his hand after we'd signed, where I thought about that Thursday afternoon in Terrence's office. The Fleece Fest. The paper slid across the desk. The 14% cut. 2 more accounts followed in the next 6 months, both former clients. Both situations where the relationship had been with me specifically and where Becca's learning curve had created some friction. I never called Terrence. I never sent an email. I never said anything publicly. I didn't need to. The work spoke. I found out later, through Dwight, who stayed on for another 8 months before leaving on his own, that Terrence had gone to the president of the company at some point and raised the idea of reaching out to me, trying to bring me back in some capacity. The president apparently asked why I'd left, and Terrence gave some version of the story that left out the niece and the demotion and focused on pursuing other opportunities. The president, from what Dwight heard, was not satisfied with that answer. I don't know what happened after that. I don't need to know. What I know is this. My son graduated in May. I flew to Champaign with my wife, and we sat in the bleachers in the sun and watched him walk across that stage. Afterward, we went to dinner, just the 3 of us, and he ordered a steak he probably couldn't finish, and he made a toast. He said, "To Dad figuring things out." My wife laughed. I laughed. It was the kind of laugh that takes a while to get back to. I'm not going to tell you leaving was easy. I'm not going to tell you the fear goes away fast, or that the financial math worked out painlessly, or that there weren't nights in those first weeks where I lay awake running the numbers again, wondering if I'd made the wrong call. There were plenty of those nights. But here's what I've come to understand. 12 years in one place and then a year out of it, loyalty to a company is not the same as loyalty to yourself. You can give everything to a place and still leave it whole, still leave it with good documentation and 2 weeks' notice and a clean handshake. You don't have to blow anything up. You don't have to be bitter. You can just decide that your time at 51 is worth something, and then go act like it is. The flickering light in the break room, by the way, I heard they finally fixed it. 6 months after I left. Took them long enough. I've thought about that Thursday a lot. Not obsessively, not the way you chew on something that's still raw, but the way you revisit a moment once you're far enough from it to see it clearly. Terrence slid that paper across the desk, and in that single motion, 12 years of my life got a price tag, 14% less than what I was already making. That was what they thought my institutional knowledge was worth in the new arrangement. A senior advisor title and a pay cut. What I've come to understand is that the outcome was never really about me. It was about Terrence. People who operate that way, who confuse authority with ownership, who treat a company's resources like a family inheritance to distribute. They're not making strategic decisions, they're making emotional ones. And emotional decisions made from a position of power almost always cost more than the person making them expects. That's not a theory, that's just what I watched happen over the following year. The thing about doing your job with integrity for a long time is that the relationships you build aren't owned by the company. They're earned. Kowalski didn't call me because I was clever or because I'd maneuvered anything. He called me because for 7 years, whenever something went wrong at 2 in the afternoon on a Friday before a holiday weekend, I answered the phone. That's it. That's the whole story. You can't transfer that with a memo and a new org chart. What I wish I'd understood earlier, and I mean years earlier, not just in that parking lot in April, is that doing good work is its own form of protection. Not in a naive way, not the universe rewards virtue kind of thinking. More practical than that. When you do the work right, consistently, without cutting corners even when nobody's watching, you build something that belongs to you and not to whatever company happens to be signing your checks. That's real. That's portable. Terrence couldn't demote that part of me. Nobody can. The hardest part wasn't leaving. The hardest part was the fear in those first weeks. The 2 a.m. math. The what-ifs. the weight of a mortgage and a kid in college and 51 years old and starting over. Courage isn't the absence of that fear. It's deciding that your self-respect is worth more than the safety of staying somewhere that no longer values you. I made that decision, and I want to be honest. It was terrifying. But it was right. My son said I seemed like I wasn't carrying something anymore. I think what I'd put down was the slow, grinding compromise of pretending that being undervalued was acceptable. Once you put that down, you don't want to pick it up again. If there's anything worth taking from this, it's that the work you do with integrity outlasts the company you do it for. And the people who see that value, the Kowalskis, the Kellermans, the Dwights, they find you. You don't have to chase them. You just have to be worth finding.